Welcome, I'm Dick Smith. As you may remember, we did a series of over 20 episodes of History Where It Happened, where we visited many historic sites in Vermont and in New York. And we were very fortunate. As part of the filming, we were allowed access to certain areas of these sites that the public is generally not allowed to visit for a variety of reasons, maybe handicap, maybe safety, and so on. So we thought we would create a special episode of History Where It Happened by going back to our old shows and pulling out those hidden nuggets of places that people generally have not visited. The first place we're going to go to is the Bennington Battle Monument, which has a hidden area that is so dangerous the public is not allowed to go there. Let's get right to the point of this show. How much work do you think is involved in changing this light bulb? It's an ordinary 90-watt light bulb. It can be bought at local electronics stores, Walmart, Kmart, wherever. It's very easy, very common, it's incandescent. Well, it takes a lot more work than most people think. The problem is that this bulb is located at the top of the Bennington Battle Monument.
Well, today is changing of the airport lights. It's a process that's done every 333 days. The airport, Bennington Airport, is 3 miles down the road to the west of us. And the lights at the top are airport lights. They're part of the landing pattern for the airport. So they have to be on at all times. So we change them a little early so they don't run out before they're...
And who's the guy you're training today?
Today we're training Charlie.
Charlie, have you been out there yet?
Not to the very top, not to the start.
So this day when you're climbing out there and climbing up the ladder, that's the first time for you?
Yeah.
120 some years, we haven't lost anybody yet.
That's right. So you're a good...
It's a repelling harness, and it's a safety harness that holds the body if by chance someone would fall. This braces them so that there's no damage to the back or, anything. And as we go up the ladder, it's just an extra safety gear. The ladder's about 60 feet up, and it's 60 feet, approximately. I've counted the rungs, but I forget all the time. Maybe I'll count them on the way down. Hey, I can see the top. I am almost there. Now, in 1891, no, it was 1889, they laid the capstone in November. The capstone is at the top here. They had an outside elevator that certain dignitaries that were involved with the building of the monument rode up in the outside elevator and put the capstone on a cold day in November. So people ask if we're afraid of doing this. Not compared to that. The stone is dolomite, came from Sandy Hill Quarries in Hudson Falls, New York. They brought it here by a train, cut the stones on site. Took them 2 years to build the stonework. When I took this job, I wasn't told it was my job to change the light bulb. It was my job to make sure it gets changed. So that's what we're doing. Then they gave me the name of the woman who changed the light bulb, and I kind of thought if she could do it, I could do it. Top of the world, calling Kevin. Kevin, if you hear me, you can turn on light bulbs.
10-4.
Okay, mission accomplished. The lights are on, the planes can land. Charlie's gonna come down and I'll go up so this camera can videotape exactly what the light bulbs look like.
All right, 10-4.
And then I'm done.
What we're trying to put together is, was this just a grist mill for, there's historical references that I found that refer to there being a mill grindstone here. We have not unearthed that yet. It might have been taken away.
Next up is the lost settlement of Daniel Shays of Shays Rebellion fame. After Shays' rebellion in Massachusetts in the 1780s, he fled with his followers to Vermont to get away from the Massachusetts militia who were chasing him. Steve Butts, a local archaeologist, heard the rumors that the lost settlement was in the Sandgate Mountains. He has been digging for the last several years and he believes he has found the actual Shays settlement. What is known as this?
This is one of the most unique sites, in your opinion, in the state of Vermont?
In the state of Vermont for this time period. It is a relatively untouched, artifact-rich, very interpretable, late 18th century into the early 19th century village that was seemingly abandoned, as Steve probably said, quite early on in the 1800s, around 1813, and then never reoccupied. And the forest essentially just grew up around it. That is extremely rare.
Next, in beautiful Plymouth, Vermont, is the President Calvin Coolidge homestead. The room located above the general store was used as the summer White House in 1924. Because it had been closed for many decades and there is no elevator, many people have never seen the inside of the room.
So welcome to Coolidge Hall. It's a great space.
Oh, this is fabulous.
And this served primarily as a dance hall for the community, but it was the only space large enough for Calvin Coolidge's office when he was here in 1924. So it's kind of neat to think that the entire country was being run from this room with a staff of 2 people.
How long was he here for this? When they
He
say
was
summer?
here that summer for 12 days. This was shortly after the death of his younger son, Calvin Jr. And so he was in mourning during that time and was anxious to get back to Washington, to get back to work. Usually the summer White Houses were 3 months in duration. In those days, both the president and the Congress left Washington because it was so hot and humid for 12 weeks. But of course, government didn't completely shut down and things had to be taken care of. And one of the items on his agenda that particular summer, 1924, was trying to decide what to do about the KKK, which was a huge problem. And it may explain why he had such a large Secret Service detachment with him. He had 18 agents here, which was the largest detachment ever assigned to a summer White House. And so they were watching him very closely.
I read somewhere that the KKK actually declined a lot during his administration.
It did, shortly after that time. But it was of concern, and there were Vermont chapters, and it is a very difficult area to protect because this village is in a bowl surrounded by hillsides. And it may explain, too, why we haven't had another sitting president here visiting. Now, again, this room is complete with all its original furniture. The tables here were made especially for Calvin for his use that particular summer. The instruments of the Plymouth Old Time Dance Orchestra are all here, and they performed music of the 1880s time period. They went on a national tour in 1926 as kind of almost like a vaudeville intermission thing at big movie theaters. And they were all friends or even relatives of Calvin, so they were quite famous, and they ended up their tour at the White House. And so we, in the course of doing this little display in this room, found an article in the New York Times that talks about this grand tour of the Plymouth Old Time Dance Orchestra. And the first line is, half of the president's hometown visits him at the White House. And then it goes through a whole explanation of what this group was. And then the last line is, the village consists of 29 inhabitants. So in other words, there were 14 people who descended on the White House that day. If you didn't know any better, of course, you're thinking thousands, right? So that's kind of amusing.
This is my kind of history. I really love the original, this is where it happened, right here.
And that's true of the entire village. You really can get the feeling of going back in time when you're walking down the street. And in fact, I kind of liken it to Vermont's Brigadoon. You have that feeling of the old days when you come here. The only thing that was missing from the whole room was the snowy owl that's up there on the shelf. And being that it was an old stuffed bird, it was ditched at some point, and we thought it was important to get it back because not only is it in photographs of this room, but it was a symbol for Calvin Coolidge. The snowy owl was his fraternity mascot, Phi Gamma Delta. And this one happened to be killed by a car and was in the freezer up at the Fish and Wildlife Department. And it took us about 6 months of clearing red tape to get permission to display this, because of course it's an endangered species. No, this is a new specimen.
A new specimen,
and, but we have a little disclaimer on the wall over there saying that we do not encourage people to collect such things. It really is, you need a scientific collection permit.
Sign of the times.
Right.
Yeah, that is. It's also hard for me to, you know, I'm trying to envision the times of Calvin Coolidge was the Roaring 20s. I mean, this was all flappers, dancing, prohibition, the whole, and look at this.
This was so unusual for most Americans, and that's why they were coming here in droves. This was unusual to find a town where people were basically living as they had more than 100 years before that. No electricity, no plumbing in the buildings, and so it was quaint for most people. From the cities, certainly, you know, and they had all the modern conveniences, many we have now, of course. This sign here is kind of interesting. This was put up by the hometown Coolidge Club that was set up to raise funds for the president's campaign in 1924. See, he was Vice President Coolidge and was up here visiting his family, working on the farm, when word came that the president, Warren Harding, had died. And they had to swear him in immediately, and the only available official happened to be Calvin's father, who administered the oath in his capacity as a notary public. Well, Calvin served the last year of Harding's term, but ran again in his own right the following year, in 1924. And this hometown Coolidge Club had raised something like $12,000 by the spring of 1924. And here you can see the sign on the post out in front of the Silly store. And this is Florence Silly here, and maybe folks would recognize the fellow standing next to him. You have any idea? Will Rogers.
Will Rogers, Oklahoma.
Yes. And so he came up here in 1925, the following year. And he and Calvin got along very well because of their shared sense of humor. And in fact, Coolidge is often depicted as an old sourpuss, but that couldn't be further from the truth. There's a book out that just fairly recently by Senator Bob Dole, all about presidential humor, and he ranks Calvin Coolidge as one of the funniest presidents that we've ever had. It's just that it was this dry Vermont wit, and you really had to pay attention and you wouldn't realize that he was not being serious. And in fact, half the time he was poking fun at the people down in Washington. They didn't have a clue.
When did the silent Cal image develop?
Well, that came up as early as
when
I think
he was
in the
Massachusetts
1910s or so. And this kind of fell into place with the number thing, keep cool and keep Coolidge. That was his slogan in 1924, basically implying that everything is going so well, why change anything? But the silent Cal was pretty much a misnomer, because if you got him on certain topics, he could go on. And in fact, he gave more speeches than all 29 presidents before him. He wrote most of them himself. He didn't have a professional speech writer. And so when Calvin Coolidge talked, those were his own words. And he gave, on the average, 2 press conferences a week, which is more than any president has ever done.
So that's up over 500, it must be.
Right, and of course it was a different day and age. And in those days, the reporters would submit written questions, and it was up to Calvin Coolidge if he was going to respond to them or not. It was just a different kind of etiquette. And then someone even calculated he said more than 8,000 words a month on the radio. And so he was the talkative president in many ways, but he wasn't into the dinner party chit-chat scene, and that's where he got this silent Cal business. There's a famous story that we think is true. As vice president, he often had to go to dinner parties as part of his obligations. And he was once seated next to a woman who told him that she had a bet with someone that she could get him to say more than 2 words during the dinner. And his response was, "You lose." And that was it. And so she lost the bet.
That's great.
That was, again, his sense of humor more than anything else.
I want them to have the rewards of their own industry. This is the chief meaning of freedom. Until we can reestablish a condition under which the earnings of the people can be kept by the people, we are bound to suffer a very severe and distinct curtailment of our liberty.
Finally, we are going to Dellwood Cemetery in Manchester, Vermont. What is neat about this site is that it's hidden in plain sight because there are no markings, it's in a remote area, and the average visitor walking past this site would have no idea of the historical significance of it. Okay, I will leave you with this short segment. I hope you enjoyed the entire episode, and we'll see you next time. This is Dick Smith. The first descendant we're going to talk about of Abraham Lincoln is Robert Todd Lincoln, the eldest son of Abraham Lincoln. He was the only son to live to maturity. Robert Todd Lincoln built his family home here in Manchester and moved in 1905. In 1926, he died at the age of 82. And right after his funeral, which was held at Hildene, which is just down the road here, he was interred in this vault, and this vault has become known as the Maxwell Vault. He was interred here for about 40 months, and then he was transferred down to Arlington National Cemetery. We have a stereograph image of this same vault taken about 100 years ago from up on the ridge, which we thought you might be interested in. Obviously, one of the main questions people ask is, why was he transferred from this vault down to Arlington National Cemetery when his father, Abraham Lincoln, was buried in Springfield, Illinois? He wanted to be buried in Springfield, Illinois, and his wife wanted him to be buried in Springfield, Illinois. Well, his wife changed her mind. She said Robert Todd Lincoln had been Secretary of War. He had been Minister to the Court of St. James, which is the predecessor to Ambassador to England. He'd been President and Chairman of the Pullman Company for over 20 years. So she said he had become a man in his own right. So 4 months after he was interred here, he was transferred down to the Washington area and then put into his final resting place, a tomb in Arlington National Cemetery. And it's also interesting because that tomb is very close to John F. Kennedy's tomb. Robert Todd Lincoln himself, to show the irony, had been associated with 3 assassinations, and his final resting place in Arlington was very close to another president who had been assassinated.